body of work that cannot be compared to anything else in cinema. And he has done so by picking up ideas that have circulated earlier in avant-garde film. So actually what I'm doing is I take Robert Brea as a pretext, or maybe as a vantage point, to give you an overview of how the idea of avant-garde film, or maybe even film, started. I'll start with a personal note. I discovered Robert Brea here at the Filmmuseum in Vienna, where I work, the Austrian Film Museum, whose co-founder, Peter Kubelka, is also an important avant-garde filmmaker. And he has programmed a cycle that is just called Was ist Film? What is film? That tries to give you an overview of the inherently cinematic ideas that have existed through the 100 years, or a bit more, you could say, that analog film has been in place, like from the very late 19th century to, you could say, the very early 21st century. And in this cycle, he has devoted 2 programs to Robert Brea and his wonderful animation work, which is not only animation work, which is already a rarity, because most other filmmakers just get 1 film in, or maybe 2, or maybe 1 program, but only Robert Brea and maybe 2 or 3 others get 2 programs of their own, because what they do is so unique. It's also maybe not a coincidence that Peter Kubelka and Robert Brea are together in the same chapter in the book called Visionary Film by P. Adam Sidney, which is kind of the foundational book on the American avant-garde cinema. And there's a reason that both of them are in the same chapter, because Peter Kubelka, born in Austria, like me, he's an Austrian, went to the US, so he's not a native American filmmaker, but he became very important for the American avant-garde. And Robert Brea, although he is an American, actually started out to make films in the early 50s in Paris when he was there as a painter. So Brea actually, and this connects him to many other important early avant-gardists, comes from painting to cinema. And he also balances the American side of the avant-garde movement and the European side of the avant-garde movement, because when he was in Europe in the 50s, he actually first discovered some European avant-garde filmmaking, even though it did not influence him. I will start with 2 or 3 quotes by Brea himself to describe the situation where he began making film. He said in an interview, "First, I was a painter. In Paris, I was influenced by the geometric abstractions of the neoplasticians, following Mondrian and Kandinsky. It was big at the time, and I began painting that way. My canvases were limited to 3 or 4 forms, each one hard-edged and having its own definite color. It was a rather severe kind of abstraction, but already in certain ways I had begun to give my work a dynamic element which showed that I was not entirely at home within the strict limits of neoplasticism. Also, the notion of absolute formal values seemed at odds with the number of variations I could develop around a single theme, and I became interested in change itself, and finally in cinema as a means of exploring this further. I wanted to see if I could possibly control a range of variations in a single composition. You can see that I sort of backed into cinema, since my main concern was with static forms. In fact, I was even a bit annoyed at first when I ran into the problems of movement." Brea is not the only painter, as we will see soon, that has moved into cinema, and he's actually solving some problems for himself that other people have solved before him. And this will be the trick of my lecture, basically. Because what I'm trying to do to you is to bring you up to the point where Robert Brea starts making films, and to see what is already there in avant-garde, what will he rediscover himself, and what will he elaborate on in totally unique ways, which Mark will tell you about later on. But to bring up something else is Brea also, let me see, does this work? I hope so. Yes. Yeah. Brea actually reinvented a handful of things that had been invented earlier. He has also talked about this in interviews. What you are seeing now is a very early animation film by the great French animator Émile Cohl, who was the first major figure in animation. And that is also something that is very interesting about Brea, that he is in a sidebar of the avant-garde or the experimental film that is treated often as something else, which is animation, but the way he uses it and the way he also makes it interact with, well, live action photography or freeze frames in later works adds to what he's doing, because the way he treats animation and the way he treats what you would call realistic photography enhances each other. But Breer was very easygoing on theory, so maybe I'm also betraying him by giving a theoretical framework to what he's doing. He started to explain, when he got into filmmaking, I did what I've always done. I skipped cinema history and started at the beginning. I used very peculiar techniques because I did not know how to animate. That I would do what Emil Cole did makes sense. You know Santayana's line about how if you don't know something, you're doomed to relive it. I'm still working out things that people worked out years ago. My rationale is to not risk being influenced, but in truth, it might just be laziness. I think it makes sense to do research, which Breer did not do, but well, if you see some of his films later, and we will get to that, you will see that he often uses very simple forms of animation to achieve very complex effects. Emil Cole, as you see in this image, also used very simple forms of animation, but back then, actually, he was one of the first persons to even invent ways of animating on film. And although this may look very simplistic to us, if we look at this image, it was so difficult for him to animate this is part of a 6 or 7 minute film, that he said, this is too much, and actually he quit animating again after a while, or at least he did not make films alone anymore. The other thing, and this is a much more important influence that we are coming through for Robert Breer, is the work of Hans Richter, a German who was part of the very first important avant-garde movement, which was called Der absolute Film. And Hans Richter, he also was a painter, interestingly, in the beginning. He also worked in other art methods, but most important to him became, after a while, cinema. So in that sense, I guess you could compare him to Breer. And he started out in the 20s. Basically, the bigger part of what I'm talking about has only to do now with silent cinema. The question of sound will not be touched in my lecture. But Hans Richter was one of the first artists who conceived of film not just as a window to the world, which is very often the first comparison that we make when we look at the cinema screen. We say, it's like a window to the world. But he also conceived of it as a canvas, as something you can paint on. And in his first films, he tried to explore that canvas and what cinema can do with it. So for the beginning, and to give you an idea in which field we are working, I would now like to show a film by Hans Richter. It is called Rhythmus 21, written 1921. It was made in the year 1921, but screened only a few years later. So the title 21, which came from here, is a bit misleading. And here he's doing breakthrough work, what cinema can do with abstract painting. I am hoping that Elisa, who is working with me from the Fondazione, can us now show this beautiful film by Hans Richter. Please start. Beautiful. Indeed, especially if you see it here on the screen, it looks very much like painting directly on the screen. But maybe there's something I want to point out, because it's very important for the films that we discuss. They were, of course, all made on analog film, on 16mm, on 35mm, and were meant to be projected in the cinema. So if you see a film like Hans Richter's Rhythmus 21, really in a cinema, although you have this flat surface on the screen, what you also can see in the darkened cinema is the light of the projector beam coming down when you have these big white spots in the midst of the darkness. So there is also a sense of volume, but it's pure light. It's a volume of pure light, and I think it adds to this feeling of watching a painting when you see a film like this on the screen. In any case, Richter is an anchor point for me, not only because he was such an important influence on Breer, I will get to that later, but also because he was maybe a driving key factor. He was not the only person, but maybe the central person of the early avant-garde movement in the 20s, which manifested itself mostly in Germany and in France. It was parallel actually to other developments in the plastic art. Surrealism plays a role, Dadaism plays a role at this time, but Richter, and his good friend actually Viking Egeling, belongs to those people who try to invent something like modern art for the cinema. What they are saying, and this is also a question that I'm thinking about, or that is in the back of my mind as I'm talking about all this, the idea of experimental film or avant-garde film, it's not really defined. We will get to that. It's a bit like the old saying, I know it when I see it. But there has been a fight about what these terms could mean. Back then, they were considered avant-garde, like in other arts. And one of the key elements for this early avant-garde movement, for this filmic avant-garde movement, happened in the year 1925. In Berlin, at the Uferpalast, there was a cinema screening on Sunday, May 3rd, of a group. The screening was promoted under the title Der absolute Film, the absolute film, which also came to mean something else. So we are still in the area of fluent definitions. But what was shown there were, on one hand, the films of Richter and of a few other people, who I'm going to show you images at least, to give you a bit of an idea what their films look like. We are moving away from Emil Kohl to people like Walter Ruttmann, who made films. You can see here 2 film frames above each other. So the idea is that you can imagine the movement that happens when you watch the film. The point is it's shorter and it gets bigger in the second screen, so it's an abstract form that moves. And Ruttmann, interestingly, also used color, unlike Richter, who still made his films in black and white. There was also a performance by Ludwig Hirschfeld-Mack, which had invented a type of color organ, so it was not really showing cinema, but was kind of animating pictures, a bit like visual music. And the concept of visual music, although we are here dealing with silent films, is very important actually for all these people who make these abstract films in the beginning. Walter Ruttmann made a handful of opus films. Here is another one, Opus 4. You can also intuit the movement that he has. And then there's the good friend of Richter called Viking Egeling. They work together. He made only one film called Symphonie Diagonale, the Diagonal Symphony, which is related to Richter's films, but his surfaces are even much more planar. And I will now give you an overview of, here are several frames from these films in one image. And when you look at it, you can see that the movements work in a way like point counterpoint. When one of the 2 forms gets bigger, the other form gets smaller. When a movement goes in this direction, there will be a counter movement in the other direction. So Egeling's film is a bit more pure, but it also lacks that voluminous quality that I described earlier with Richter. But interestingly enough, there are also films that contain not just, it's not only about abstract painting, although there is this idea of making film an outgrowth of painting or of using it like painting. But there is another filmmaker who is actually a painter, Fernand Léger, who made together with the director Dudley Murphy the wonderful film called Ballet Mécanique, which starts actually with an animated sequence. So you can see a drawing of Charlie Chaplin lifting his head, greeting you. It's a bit rudimentary but knowledgeable, but recognizable. But he also includes in his films many objects, bottles, for instance. But also, yeah, no, too far, sorry, this one I wanted. But also like this shot of a woman, but if you look at her, the way her eyes are closed, she almost looks like a puppet. And these shots of the woman are actually intercut with the feet of a puppet. So that's the reason why the film is called Ballet Mécanique. It's like we are entering a world of objects, where even the real life elements basically are like something painted. That is one of the important ideas of the avant-garde, of experimental film, that you do not just reproduce reality, like it's often assumed with documentary film, although it's much more complex, of course, because each documentary filmmaker already makes a choice just by choosing his viewpoint. But that everything you put on screen is something formed, something made for the cinema. You do not just record reality, you invent reality. There was another film shown called Antracte by René Clair, who later became a famous and very good fiction filmmaker. And it was made as an intermission for a Dadaist ballet. That's why it's called Antracte. And this film actually does not really at first glance fit in with all the other films that I've shown you examples now, because it's not abstract. It is all real life things, but it's almost like a comedy. It brings us back to Chaplin that we saw at the beginning of the Léger film, because things happen like a person dies and the hearse is moving through the city, but the hearse is not drawn by horses, it's drawn by camels. And suddenly it begins to move faster and faster, and the people start running after it. So it's a very absurd film, and it gives us an idea of this movement in the 20s of being very alive, of trying to provoke, trying to find new things, of breaking actually through the possibility of what film can be, something that is basically encapsulated in this very beautiful image, where in the end somebody is breaking through the screen itself, through the film, the end sign that we have at the end of the movie. So apart from this filmmakers that were shown in the series, the Absolute Film, there are many related ones that experiment on similar things at the time. They also all come from France and Germany. It's quite interesting. This is the only movement in the avant-garde history before the Second World War, and it's really hand in hand with artists. There are so many painters in there. One of the next key figures is Man Ray, who is of course much more famous for his other arts, but he also made a handful of films, all of them wonderful. And one of the best is called Retour à la Raison, Return to Reason, which is of course an ironic title, because in true Dadaist spirit, he's actually trying to make you see the world differently. And what he's using are a handful of different things. One major element is a naked woman's torso, which we can see here. But another element is something that he also used in his art, the so-called rayographs, which are a bit like X-rays, maybe you could say, but negative X-rays of something you see. So here you have an image of nails, actually, that is treated as a rayograph and becomes this abstract composition. The funny thing is that Ray wanted to show this film at the Dadaist gathering, and he had not really finished the film, and only at the last minute got the idea to make it better by including those rayographs. And so what he did actually was to insert many of these shots of these rayographs at the last moment, which led to the sad fact that the copy that he showed was spliced rather badly. And that the film broke down several times. So although this film is only 3 or 4 minutes long, there were many intermissions, and although people just saw glimpses of this and that, it caused a huge uproar. There were fights in the audience, some people screaming, "This is absolutely great what he's doing, it's absolutely new." Other people said, "What is this crap," basically. So there was a fight in the audience only over these few abstract images, which also gives you maybe an idea of the excitement back then in trying to come up with new artistic solutions, because of course other stories, we will get to films like Un Chien Andalou by Buñuel or Dali, which has shocking images, that those films, of course, caused an uproar you can still imagine today. But this film that has only mostly abstract content manages to cause an uproar as well. So you can see what this really, what the fight back then is really about is actually maybe to try to get a new definition of cinema, to achieve breakthroughs in art, which what experimental film is of course about, because it was so back then, and it is still the same way now. When people talk about movies, usually they mean feature films. They mostly mean fiction films, occasionally documentary. But the avant-garde is actually a very limited area, which is very strange to me, because in many ways, it is the pure cinema. It is that element of cinema that tries to discover the things that only cinema can do. Jonas Mekas, a very important avant-garde filmmaker from the US, once said the wonderful sentence, many people say that they love movies, but what they really mean is that they love stories. And I think that hits the point at this misunderstanding. But at the same time, many avant-garde films, at least to me, and that's why I love it so much, are not that difficult. They are not theoretical, not strange experiments, but they are very alive on a very sensual level, which is something we will get to again with Breer when we see his films and a few other examples that I'm going to show you. But there's something that draws you in and makes it very easy actually to watch avant-garde films. They are intuitively understandable. So it is kind of strange that it has always been this sideline form. And maybe I want to give you just a quick quote by Fernand Léger, who on the occasion of this exhibition Absolute Film made a text, wrote a text called A New Realism, the Object, where basically he calls already, he issues a call that film should be seen differently, that all current cinema is romantic, literary, historical, expressionist, etc., etc. Let us forget all this and consider, if you please, a pipe, a chair, a hand, an eye, a typewriter, a hat, a foot, and so on and so on. And so these images that he conjures in your head basically do not tell you a story, they give you plastic impressions. And here is where Léger, for instance, says, a new idea of cinema could start, because what he thinks is that cinema might find out the perfect way to show you these objects. He says, to get the right plastic effect, the usual cinematographic methods must be entirely forgotten. The question of light and shade becomes of prime importance. The different degrees of mobility must be regulated by the rhythms controlling the different speeds of projection. The timing of projections must be calculated mathematically. What he says then, it's like a futurist thing. He says, new men are needed. Men who have acquired a new sensitiveness toward the object and its image. An object, for instance, if projected 20 seconds, it's given its full value. But if it's projected 30 seconds, it becomes negative. It was in there too long. So this idea that Léger demands, but does not develop, because Palette Mécanique is his only film, is something that is realized in the work of later filmmakers. And if you ask me, Robert Breer is one of them. Léger, however, is not the only theoretician. In fact, our friend Hans Richter may be an even more important figure when it comes to considering what a theory of film can be. Although Rudolf Arnheim, a very important writer on film, really demolished what Richter showed in the screening des Absolute Film, I translated it from his German review back then, ultimately, Hans Richter's uninspired babble is only suited to discredit the entire movement. Richter actually was a boon to the movement. And not only that, he expanded his ideas continually as he kept on working, even though he would only occasionally work in film. But a very important moment comes in the summer of 1929, which also maybe not by coincidence is near the end of the silent era. Sound film has already started. You could say around 1930, sound film starts to dominate. But at this point, we are still dealing mostly with silent films. And there is a big exhibition by the German Werkbund in 1929, for which Richter organizes a series called The Artistic Film. And it includes, of course, the films I've already mentioned that were shown in the series The Absolute Film, but also of their French colleagues. But Richter also shows films by Charles Chaplin. He shows what is back then the big thing, the Russian films by Sergei Eisenstein and Dziga Vertov, who are also so important because they have theoretically new ideas, avant-gardistic ideas, actually, that will also influence not just normal fiction filmmaking, but also avant-garde filmmaking. But he's also showing more conventional films, like, say, the films by G.W. Pabst, an Austrian filmmaker who worked in Germany and famous for his films with Louis Brooks, like Pandora's Box. But he also made a film about psychoanalysis called Secrets of the Soul, which is very interesting in trying to translate something that the surrealists also worked on, dreamlike ideas into a film story, which is also something that back then is in vogue, this idea that films are also like your dreams. And Richter, actually, although he wants to show the film, is, for instance, very unhappy that Pabst is also invited, because he says, but he's too conventional to be here as a speaker. He would much rather talk to people like Eisenstein or people like Vertov, to filmmakers who make another kind of absolute film, which is quite interesting to realize that although we have now associated with mostly graphic works, another thing that is coming to be called in the time are exactly, wait, I'm here too far. Yeah, these Russian films. Here we have, for instance, a shot from Vertov, the man with the camera. His idea is the kino eye, which is symbolized in this image. You can really see the eye and the camera, they become one, and you have this man with the camera moving through the crowds. At the same time, there are German films like Berlin, Symphonie einer Großstadt, Symphony of a City, again by Walter Ruttmann, by whom before I showed this abstract opus films. And here he tries to portray a metropolis, tries to give a feeling of this new metropolitan life, of this pulsating speed. And of course, for that, in a very different way, he comes back to similar ideas, to ideas that are associated with the absolute film, this idea that film is written, that film is montage. But you can do it also not just with abstract things, but with real images or with images of reality. And Richter, at the time of organizing this Congress, actually develops ideas that go further, and he starts writing a book that comes out that very same year. And it's a book, unfortunately here it's very small, that has one of my favorite titles. It's called Filmgegner von heute, Filmfreunde von morgen. Enemies of film today, friends of film tomorrow. And in it he tries to explain what makes film so special, what makes it unique. And I guess it's worth quoting in full the intro, also because I translated it from German to English. I think there is no English version of this book. And Richter begins with the momentous sentence, "Are you an enemy of film? The way film today is, it cannot have enough enemies. Today's enemy of film has a cultural mission to fulfill, to fight the bad film, to protest against bad films, to organize the protest. The more enemies of film, the greater the chances for better films. Don't believe what they tell you, that film has to be bad, because that is what the audience wants. You yourself are the audience. Do you want those films that you are offered today? Don't you also think that film might not be better? We want to show you that film has rich artistic means. We want to show you its principles to enable you to not just feel which films are bad, but also to know why. We want to improve your ability to judge, so you can demand a better film. Or, if you are a film expert, we want to appeal to your sense of responsibility. Can you step aside in the face of developing these artistic possibilities? You have to act out against the bad film. You all should learn to despise the bad film, even more than you did up to now. But you should also learn to love film again, as an art. You, today's enemies of film, shall become tomorrow's friends of film. You are the hope of film. So, for the moment, turn off all your ideas about today's cinema. Most of all, don't think of theater and acting. We want to examine the means objectively. And then he gives a little history of film. The way he does it is worth noting. He uses almost no words. It's a very visual book, which I think is a very sensible idea if you want to explain film. And what he's doing actually is, wait, we are moving from the city images. Yes, here we have a double page. you can actually recognize on the left side the very scene from, or the very shots of Symphonie Diagonale that I showed you. And what you can see, what he's using are actually film strips, so that you can see what film is doing over time. On the right side, he gives you an idea of how to represent speed in cinema with this shot of the car. Sorry, I just need a glass of water. What he is trying to bring out basically is that the key elements of film are rhythm and montage. Sound is only briefly mentioned at the end. He nearly does not consider that. And actually, it's quite interesting. The version I showed you of this book, it's the new edition, which was made 30 years later in the 60s. And in the second forward, he says, everything I said 40 years ago still applies exactly the same way. If I would write the book again now, the only thing I would change are my examples for the bad films and the kitsch of commercial cinema, which is also quite amusing, because if you look at this book, the examples that he takes for commercial cinema are not always what we expect, but films of people who are considered great masters of the art form. People like Fritz Lang or Erich von Stroheim, who are considered among the greatest fiction filmmakers. But I guess for an avant-gardist like Richter, they have sold out. In any case, Richter, like many others, will have to leave Germany very soon. He goes through the Switzerland to the US because he's fleeing from the Nazis. And actually, with the time of the Nazis, all the movements that were connected to abstract film or to avant-garde, of course, come to an end because the Nazis are, well, outlawing them. At the same time, you could say that this whole big, important avant-garde movement of the 20s also comes to an end in France at the same time, where we have the last hurrah of surrealism. But for a last hurrah, actually, it's only a series of highlights. There are some of the most important films in the history of cinema that happen at this point. There are films like Germaine Dulac's Le Coquille et le Clergyman, an adaptation of a surrealist script by the great Antonin Artaud. There is, of course, the most famous of surrealist films, Un Chien Andalou by Luis Buñuel, which opens with this shocking image of an eye being cut. But what is interesting about this film, and although surrealist tendencies will play a role maybe in different ways when they are picked up again by later filmmakers, what is unique about Buñuel's film is that, unlike all the other filmmakers I've discussed up to now, who are trying to achieve very conscious artistic effects, the effect of Buñuel is so great because he's trying to be most natural. In his film Un Chien Andalou, he and Salvador Dali, yet another painter with whom he developed it, tried to come up with, let's say, something that is like a constant nightmare, a world that does not follow logic, but it's presented in the most matter-of-fact and casual way possible, which even enhances the idea of surrealism. At the same time, another very important filmmaker, also important to Brier, as we shall see, is Jean Vigo, who starts out with a documentary he makes. It's called Apropos de Nice, which is almost surrealist in the way it juxtaposes the rich Nice and the poor Nice. And then he makes a 45-minute film called Zero de Conduite, which is also one of the masterpieces of surrealism and of anarchism. And it's taking place in a boarding school where all the school children decide that they have had enough. They rebel against the deliberately ridiculous establishment. Here you can see a shot of the teachers. They tear up their beds. They stage a small-scale revolution. And Brier, although you would consider him an animation man, actually says, somebody I always mention as having a powerful influence on me was Jean Vigo, who didn't make animated abstract films. His spirit of free association in Apropos de Nice, for instance, and the kind of cutting he does there moved me. And I liked Zero de Conduite, his anarchism, his humor, and his esprit. I could identify with him. I have an aversion to just purely abstract films, which is quite an interesting thing to say, but I think it also gives us an idea about what makes Brier himself so alive. his filmmaking so alive. He's not interested in trying out something abstract. He wants to find something pulsating. He wants to tell us something about his life, even if it at first seems like a few painted doodles. Well, maybe I'm overstretching the thing. Anyway, what happens in the 30s is basically that avant-garde film as a movement, as we had it for this short moment in the 20s, disintegrates. Some people try things here, some people try things there, but really it's only in the 40s and actually really the post-war era that an avant-garde movement starts to happen again. Bria will come in a few years later when these first things are already on their way, which may be helpful to him. But what is interesting to me now that I've, in preparation for this lecture, looked again at what will come after the war, because before the war we have like this last gasp of French surrealism. Another person that would be of importance would be the great poet Jacques Cocteau, who also makes a film called Blood of the Poet, where here you can see a very surrealist image from, on the side, this moving, this rotating screen. It's almost like one of those earlier abstract films. And after the war, again in France, we have films like the great documentary Blood of the Beasts by Georges Franju, which actually just portrays a slaughterhouse. And the way he does so, it transcends the idea we have of a normal documentary. It's really surrealist in the intensity, in the violence that it shows, that the blood spurting from the animals. And of course, on the one hand, you can say it's a comment on the big slaughter of the Second World War that just happened. But on the other hand, I think it also continues this idea of how can we make cinema talk in a way that befits cinema itself, not try to frame it into a story, not try to make it into something less than a pure cinematic event, something that is exciting at every moment. And the same thing from a very different vantage point starts to happen in the US. We have the filmmaker Maya Deren. Here you can see her eye, as with the Buñuel film before, The Eye and the Knife, here used very differently. A key turns into a knife. Maya Deren made films, Meshes of the Afternoon and At Land and a few others that pick up this surrealist idea, but in a very lyrically, in a very dreamy way. What she is beginning actually is another movement, I would argue, that includes such major figures. Here we have two more images. Here you see the dreamlike, almost as if she's enveloped in dream, Maya Deren. Compare this with this image from Jacques Cocteau's Sang des Poètes, which is very stylized, very self-consciously arty. Whereas with Maya Deren, you have this dream, this idea what in literature is called the lyrically eye. Other filmmakers who become very important avant-garde filmmakers also come in at this point. We have, for instance, Kenneth Anger, who go on to make very different films, but one of his earliest films seen here called Fireworks is also a very personal nightmare, which also has a very subjective quality. And of course, the master of that is the great Stan Brakhage, who starts filmmaking a bit later. Actually, I've also put in this, well, color photo to remind me that we are now moving into the 50s. This is actually a film of Brakhage from the 50s already called Anticipation of the Night. But what you can see or maybe feel when you look at this frame is how his hand is stretching out, this subjective gesture. And what is also very important for Brakhage is that many of his films are almost like what we would call today home movies. His family is in there. Here you see one of his small children. But what he does with it is he finds a way of transforming it into a completely unique poetry. And as this wave actually of new filmmaking appears, there is also a new consciousness beginning to develop. There's an era of film clubs that starts. There are things like, for instance, Cinema 16 in New York, founded by the immigrant Amos Vogel, a very important person who starts to show programs that are unlike what is seen in commercial cinema. He combines avant-garde film with documentary, with industrial films, even with fiction sometimes. But what he creates, and his club Cinema 16 is just the most famous one, is he creates also a platform where avant-garde filmmakers can connect through. This happens also at other places all over the US. And there is now a moment at the late 40s where you can say the idea develops in the avant-garde that they are not only from different angles trying to find something, but they also find out about the history that they have had. Because, of course, in those film clubs, you will be able to see films by Buñuel or by Cocteau, but also the new films by Maya Dern, bringing it together. A sense of history envelops. And the idea begins that people start to question themselves, well, what is avant-garde film? Something very important happens in 1949 in Knokke in Belgium. There's a festival which will later be called the Experimental Film Festival. They eliminate the vowels, actually, we call it just experimental. But in the first edition, which takes place in 1949, it's called the Festival International du Film Expérimental et Poétique, experimental and poetic cinema. Not a bad way, maybe, to describe what this avant-garde is. Only a few years later, the first book is published on what is avant-garde. It's by the great German-born writer Peter Weiss, who lives in Sweden and who also works as a painter and also starts to make films. And just like Breer, he also starts to make films because he's not satisfied with just what painting is. He wants to achieve something more. And he's the first person to try to write the history of the avant-garde and includes most of those films that I've talked to you about. But he is also not afraid to include some fiction films. There are some filmmakers like Carl Theodor Dreyer from Denmark, who is by many avant-gardists actually allowed in their canon. But he's also not afraid to include a film like Citizen Kane, the famous Hollywood film by Orson Welles, because he says it has so many innovative ideas that in many ways it is also avant-garde. So Weiss starts to develop these ideas. In the 50s, a second festival happens in Knokke, which is now already called the Festival of Experimental Film. And actually, who is represented there, among other people, is Robert Breer and a handful of other important avant-garde filmmakers, important animation filmmakers, who have continued this idea of the abstract film throughout the 30s and 40s. One of them is Norman Mclaughlin, who began to work in Canada. He not only worked there, and who had this idea of transforming music into abstract painting. Here are two images from his film Untitled Chapter, which takes a jazz piece by Oscar Peterson and tries to transform it into pure movement. Another person who does this is the great Len Lai, who works in New Zealand and in Britain, actually for the post office. The British post office in the 30s funds a series of films that are also considered as commercials for themselves, but mostly they give absolute freedom to the filmmakers. And so, for instance, in this film Traitor 2, Len Lai is combining the rhythm of workaday Britain, like realistic ideas with very abstract ideas. Here you can see there is a photo, a live action photo, a live action image he uses as the background, but what he's doing, he's painting above it. He makes abstract splashes, and he moves on actually to making films where he only scratches into the screen. This is from his late work Free Radicals, which gets the main prize at Knokke in the year when Breer is also there, which is a film where the soundtrack is also very jazzy, and what he's painting on the film strip is like dancing, interacting with the soundtrack. So maybe now we've reached at least a point where we should consider sound. But instead of considering sound, actually, I want to go back to the beginning and one last time ask myself now, what actually could avant-garde film really be? And for that, I cite two other avant-garde filmmakers, Hans Scheugel, Ernst Schmidt Jr., they are two Austrians, who wrote in the 70s a dictionary of the avant-garde and experimental films. And there's a quote in there that is quite intriguing. They write about the term avant-garde film. In the 1920s, a few like Eggeling, Richter, Ruttmann, Claire, Man Ray, Buñuel, Cocteau, etc. found ways to make use of the collective event film for personal expression. And the only legitimate term for the works, namely art, was already occupied because it was applied wrongly to works made in industrial circumstances with the coating of individualism. The films like from David Ward Griffith, from Murnau, from Antonioni, which I guess we could all agree, they are great films, but are they really avant-garde? Schmidt and Scheugle make an interesting proposal which didn't work out. They say, these films, or the newer films by Jean-Luc Godard or by Alain Resnais, we should call them semi-avant-garde because they are half industry and only half avant-garde, because the real avant-garde film, the real experimental film, it has nothing to do with the industry. It's a personal expression. At that time, after the war, experimental film also starts to take on this. Occasionally, it is seen as he makes an experimental film because it's an experiment for the feature films he wants to make. But the true experimental filmmakers, of course, reject that idea. No, you don't want to make normal feature films. What you want to do is find out what cinema itself is, to make films that are cinema, to make real experimental cinema. And actually a new self-confidence develops and leads to the founding of Corps in the 1960s. It brings new ways of distribution. It makes experimental films much more visible than actually these classics we know had ever been during their lifetime, because most of those films were not made with distribution in mind. But now the avant-garde says, no, we also want to be seen, and rightfully so, because what they are doing is maybe really film. And now, as an example, actually as my favorite example of how you could wind up with a working idea for what experimental film is, I again go back to Hans Scheugle, who in 2010 wrote another text where he was taking part in a discussion where the terms experimental film and avant-garde film again had come under attack. And what he wrote was like, despite all these discussions in the past, experimental film and avant-garde film are still used as synonyms for those films that can be considered a part of modern art. There are three simple reasons. First, unlike in other arts, these films need a definition that distinguishes them from the mainstream. Second, no other term was found that could replace them. And third, their long history gives these two terms a stability and a practical value. He has a point there, but what really interests me is he asks himself the question, what could this really mean? Experiment in art. And he gives what he himself calls an enlightening example, using the Austrian filmmaker Kurt Krenn, a very important figure and also a unique figure, almost like Breer, but in a very different way, of the avant-garde, who was interviewed about some of his films, called Asyl was one of them, and the other two, W and B, and talked about the new techniques he uses. And he says, Kurt Krenn says, that is the thing with all the films I ever did, the adventure, that I never know what the end result will be. I'm not like so many other artists which repeat themselves once they found their trick. Rather, what I want is to discover something new every time, something that is new for me as well. And when I see my film on a screen for the first time, I think, oh my God, what have I done? And I have to watch my own film 2 times, 3 times, until I get it, until I get into it. And if it hadn't been that adventure, I would never have made that film. And actually, this adventure can be illustrated very well with a film by Kurt Krenn himself, which he made. He was living in exile back then in Vermont, and he had found a roll of expired infrared film. So he didn't know if, when he makes a film with this expired film, if actually anything will result or if it's already kaput anyway. But what he's doing, he goes every day to the same spot in Vermont and films a tree. One shot of the tree. But he does not do it chronologically. He sets up a plan for the next few months and say on the first day, he shoots frame number 1. On the second day, he shoots frame number 75. On the third day, frame number 12, and so on until all the frames are filled. And of course, what this makes is that this tree seems to dance in time. The weather changes, the sunlight changes. Actually, I want to share that film now with you. Elisa, I hope, will again have the power to show you the film. Kurt Krenn's Tree again and see how it's pulsating, how cinema explodes, basically. Please, Elisa. Yeah. Again, of course, it's not the same to see this on the small screen. Like when you experience it in the cinema, it's like a storm of lightning coming over you with all these changes in light and so on. But maybe you will have an option at some point to see this film on the big screen, or maybe buy it on DVD. Actually, good people of Sixpack, if you followed the newsletters that were sent out as promoting the event by the Fondazione, one of them was made by Sixpack Film in Austria, which is one of the good places for avant-garde films. And for them, you can rent the films of Kurt Krenn, but you can also buy a DVD with several of his films. And I would recommend maybe you should do that to get a pure experience. But anyway, the idea that I want to get at is this film was chosen to show what an experiment can be, and also because it's made of single frames, which is something that Breer will start to work with later on, and which is very important to him. And this idea of experimenting, and here I want to maybe come almost to a close with a quote by Breer, is very much the same like what Krenn said. In talking about his film Recreation, Breer said, I made it in a kind of deliberate feeling of wonderment. What the hell will this look like, you know? That kind of thing. And I don't want to know whether this is cinema or not. It doesn't matter. And then I would go back and try to incorporate some notions of control and construction. So it's also about, for Breer, about this, conflicting forces of freedom on the one hand, and of course the necessity to construct something. Like Krenn also constructed, of course, a plan on how he would film this tree in time, but he could not foresee what would happen, how the weather would change, how the animals would move, stuff like that. So I feel it's a very good example of what experimental film can be and what its glory is. So maybe to bring this full circle, the idea at the end is to relate the two film examples we've seen to two films by Robert Breer. And Elisa will show you now at the end two films that they also have in their wonderful exhibition, I guess. One is called Form Phases 4, and for Breer, actually, it was like, it's a very early film by Breer, and it's one of those where he still tries to translate paintings into cinema. And he himself said, actually, when he discovered Hans Richter, he said, he had done all this already in 1921 in Rhythmus 21. I guess it's pretty obvious that I'd seen that film by the time I made Form Phases 4. I got to know Richter later in New York, but I remember having that film a big impact. I lifted stuff right out of it. Yes, he did, and you will see that. But you will also see that he already brings in new ideas. And then for the end, you will see the very short 2-minute masterpiece, Recreation, where he's taking some of those notions of painterly and of abstraction and moving them much, much further with the single frame explosion. I hope you will enjoy them. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to replay recreation now because it has sound and you absolutely have to hear it with sound. Just a second. So, okay, you did hear it with sound, yes, didn't you? Anyone? Nope. Okay. No sound. Okay, let's retry one more time.
Elisa, would you like me to try? Because I have a file.
Yeah, we have it too, but yeah, you can try.
I can try.
Thank you. Sorry, we're very sorry for these technical problems. Was not planned this way.
Une surface grise brouillée parsemée de plates taches noires s'étend indéfiniment en tous sens et c'est précisément à 5 cm au-dessus d'elle qu'aura lieu cette recréation. Une surface grise brouillée parsemée de plates taches noires s'étend indéfiniment en tous sens et c'est précisément à 5 cm au-dessus d'elle qu'aura lieu cette recréation. Surgit brusquement d'un point de lumière verdâtre le mystérieux objet qu'entendant esquisse-toi ce convolution extrasensorielle puis s'en va se parer pour les petits lits blancs. Inimitablement circonstanciel, une grisaille opaque est un tangage à billes. Cette structure noire n'est pas ajourée malgré les apparences qui résultent de la convergence fortuite d'une triple série d'oscillations se dédoublant réciproquement et non pas de la simple périodicité sous-lunaire comme on pourrait le croire. Ces jours apparents ne sont pas non plus carrés, étant très légèrement incurvés vers le haut et vers le bas plein de sève populaire. Mais le passage fulgurant d'une agglomération compacte carlin inoxydable n'est guère fait pour nous ébahir, car il laisse à peine de traces, et le mont septuagénaire sourit sans fin.
Okay, now now I'm reading sound but no picture. But some other person just told me they saw and heard it. Okay. For everyone who didn't see it and hear it, we're just gonna share it with you afterwards so that we don't have to show it a fifth time. Sorry again for those problems. It's apparently a classic for us here to have those little problems with online lectures. However, thank you very much, Christoph. I don't know if you can hear me. Another technical problem, but it was very interesting. And I think if there are no more questions, I see that people are writing in the chat. Someone asked about the book examples that Christoph made. You can, I mean, we have all your questions, we will collect them, and we can also then answer you if you just submit an email to our email that you will find on the website. If there's no other questions, then thank you very much again, Christoph, and we will now have a short break of 5 minutes and be back in 5 minutes with Mark Toscano. Okay, thank you very much. See you in a bit.
Hi.
Hello again.
I wasn't sure if I was just supposed to start or if you were going to say something.
No.
That's why I was waiting.
We would just want to thank you two for being here. Good morning. We all know for you the day is here. It's dark already. The day is ending. For you, the day is starting. And I don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you very much for being here. And please go on.
All right. Well, I would really love to thank you, Elisa and Sylvia, and also not just the foundation, but Antonio Dalle Nogare himself for being such wonderful, gracious hosts. It's really a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk at some length about a filmmaker and artist who is very important to me personally. Breer is really, I think, one of the great, not just cinema artists and animation artists, but one of the great artists of the 20th century. And I hope to go into a little bit of why I think he's so crucial and fascinating. I also really want to thank GB Agency and Nathalie Boutin, who has been a tireless advocate for the significance of Breer's work. And she's done amazing curatorial work and organizational work, and just to get Breer's work in various mediums very visible. She's been fantastic to work with for me. I also really want to thank Robert's wife, Kate Flax, who has also been a fantastic collaborator for me as well, because if it hasn't been mentioned already, I'm a film preservationist, and Robert Breer's films are among the work that I'm dealing with as a preservationist and archivist. So I take care of his film collection and I work on preserving and restoring his films. And so I talk to Kate fairly regularly, and she's just an amazing person. And I want to thank her in particular for letting me dig into his original animation artwork and some of his files earlier this week, partly to prepare for this talk, to be able to present you some, I think, really fun images, but also it's genuinely incredibly helpful to me as an archivist, because, for example, I might look at some of the original artwork for a film to help determine how the color should look in the movie as I'm restoring it. So that's been incredibly helpful, and I really want to thank her in many ways for her collaboration and help. So let me share my screen. There we go. So my talk today on Robert Breer won't be a completely conventional overview of his career, although I think I'll cover a reasonable amount of his work. Instead, I really want to attempt to define a few fundamental things about Robert Breer's interests and his practice. One will be his film's exceptional relationship both to painting and also to conventional animation. And I'll also be talking about his conception and use of the dimension of time, which for me is one of the most exciting things about his approach, not only to film and animation, but his gallery works and his sculptures as well. So to start with, I want to share with you a slideshow of paintings by Robert Breer, which were made in the early 1960s. So as you can see, it's a very diverse mix of approaches, but generally there are compositions based around simple but deliberately casual geometric forms, scattered line work, an overall sense of kinetic energy and spontaneity, I think. You might be reminded a bit of the work of Franz Klein, Cy Twombly, Willem de Kooning. But for me, really, Breer's approach to color, line, and texture are very much his own, embodying, I think, an interest in graphically open and responsive forms, marked by dynamic brushwork, elements of surprise, and an improvisational visual energy. Okay, so as you can see, this isn't really a selection of paintings in the traditional sense, but in fact, individual film frames of his 1961 animated film Blazes. So conventionally, animation is much more interested in continuity, with each frame in the service of fluid motion. If we step through the individual frames of a more conventional film or animation one at a time, at a slideshow pace, they usually present themselves to us as sequential and related, as images that are part of a continuous sequence.
Wow, it must be expensive to produce all these cartoons.
Well, we cut corners. Sometimes to save money, our animators will reuse the same backgrounds over and over and over again.
So even though each frame could be said to have its own pictorial integrity as a still image, we generally relate it, we generally relate to it instead as integrally part of a larger whole. So this is partly because in a typical animation, like the Simpsons clip, the differences between those individual frames are minimal and incremental. They represent slices of frozen time that are part of a fluid continuum. But what happens if the individual frames are instead quite different from one another? As I hope you would agree from my earlier demonstration, in Blazes, each little painting that makes up the individual frames of the photographed film retains quite a bit of its own integrity as a complete image. This isn't just the case when you slow it down to look at it a frame at a time, as I was doing earlier. This quality, I think, is present even when the film runs at a normal speed. I think this is because unlike most animation, and certainly unlike almost all animation that had come before Robert Breer, these sequential frames may share a larger aesthetic language, but otherwise they have no defined formal relationship to each other. They're not individual steps along the path of a traditional fluid continuum, but rather visual monuments unto themselves. And they kind of defy traditional continuity in that way. The fact that they share a very general aesthetic language, I think helps us to familiarize ourselves with them. But despite this, or maybe even helped by this, their individual respective integrity is retained rather than being absorbed into the flow of the film in a total way. And yet watching Blazes, we don't really have the sense of seeing merely a very fast slideshow of separate stills. The rapid progression of these disparate frames nevertheless does create an experience of some kind of continuity, although it's an unusual continuity, one which is at least partly created in our own minds as our brain seeks to find visual and temporal connections between these unrelated individual moments. In the terminology of traditional animation production, the keyframes are the major points of visual definition in a sequence, the key reference points, such as Daffy Duck yelling into the mouse hole to get the mouse to come out, and then the mouse coming out. All these frames in between these two defining keyframes are just the connecting frames, which join the first keyframe with the second keyframe in a sequence of continuous motion. And not surprisingly, in animation, these in-between frames are called just that, in-betweens. They function visually to create continuity and fluidity, as well as narrative and visual logic based on a readable progression.
Come on there, you rat! Come on out! Oops. Go back in again.
So there's no connective, as for Breer, or at least Blazes, we might think of this film as being made up entirely of keyframes with no in-betweens. There's no connective tissue, only a series of primary defining moments whose interrelationship rests on different visual cues and the highly creative processing capabilities of our brains. Any illusion of motion we perceive is a different kind of illusion than the one that usually works for us in more conventional animation or movies. In Blazes, it's a combination of deliberate compositional rhyming, false visual cues, coincidences of shape and line, and some inexplicable perceptual surprises that Breer couldn't even have predicted. And although we may admire each of the small paintings that make up the film's units of imagery, or we may appreciate some of them more than others, relating to them as individual works of art that we could imagine being meant for a gallery wall, they weren't really made for that type of interaction. They're really raw visual material for an animated film, the individual parts that make up the whole. And yet they still carry aesthetic integrity as individual images. In fact, Brier's concept for the film, I think, even very much depends on their ability to retain integrity, because that's where the tensions of time, motion, and perception are accentuated. This film was made not long after Brier returned to the US from Paris, 1959. He just made it 2 years after that. And it was at this time he was still very much working out his relationship to film and animation, as well as how this related to his painting practice. The explorations of time and change that filmmaking represented in his practice allowed him to experiment with elements of collage, continuity, disruption, evolution, and surprise that were unavailable in static painting or sculpture. In fact, it's revealing that the original working title of Blazes, while he was in the process of making it, was instantaneousness, suggesting the film was for him very much about the dimension of time and the way that his rapid succession of images created an unusual tension between continuity and discontinuity, falling somewhere in between in a manner which almost suggests a stable and eternal present tense, a conceptual simultaneity. The film doesn't go anywhere obvious or specific, and the succession of images almost have the feeling of rapidly flipping through a set of paintings held in one's hands, which can be shuffled and looked at without respect for typical structure or temporal coherence. The awareness of the power of time as a fundamental quality of the cinematic art form was something that Brier explored as early as his very first film, Form Phases, from 1952. I actually want to show you this very short film in its entirety. It's only a little more than a minute long because it's his earliest cinematic work, but it's also the one I think that shares the most direct emerging connection to his painting practice, in the sense that it only sort of tentatively introduces the qualities of time, change, and motion. Did you mute me because of the person with the leaf blower outside my window? Yeah, that was not part. The film's a silent film, but the soundtrack was being provided by somebody doing some gardening outside my window here. From this very, very simple beginning, Brier radically and elaborately developed his thinking around animation extremely quickly. And it was only a few years later, really 2 years later, after a thrillingly diverse set of short non-objective films, that he produced his first masterpiece, Form Phases #4, which Christoph showed at the end of his presentation. So even as simple as Form Phases is, it's already challenging some of the expectations both of painting and animation. First, interestingly to me, the film's imagery is actually in negative polarity from the drawings that he made it from. He treats a black and white negative photographic image as if it's a positive one. There's also an early interest in creating a dynamic tension between motion and stillness. And perhaps most surprisingly, there are even hand-colored additions to the actual film strip. Some are very precise, coloring certain portions of the image, and then some are deliberately freeform, colored lines drawn vertically down the film strip to connect two sequences, or early in the film, this brief sequence where the film strip is colored red all over. Brier has said that he started working in film in a manner related to his paintings at the time, but he wasn't even sure he was all that interested in making films at first. But as he said in a 1971 interview, and this is a quote, "I fell into a certain dead end in the painting at that time and the neoplastic ideal. Films were very liberating, so I took advantage of it. I wanted to see some things I'd never seen before. Actually, those collage films were in the same spirit as the abstract paintings, trying to distill the essence of the medium. For me, film was another medium that permitted mixing of all this other extraneous stuff, ideas and words, and configurative elements that I couldn't justify in paintings anymore." At least as far back as the 1920s, many artists who identified primarily as painters turned to animation and film with great interest and ideas. You saw some of their work in Christoph's presentation. And at a fundamental level, many of them had the same reason for wanting to explore film as an extension of, or a progression from, or even an alternative to their painting practice. They wanted to see the images move. As an archivist and a curator working with a lot of experimental animators, I can tell you genuinely that a large percentage of the animators I work with who had started out in painting have told me this exact same reason for beginning to work in animation. They wanted to see the images move. Except I would refine this reason to make it even more fundamental. I think it wasn't even purely a desire to see the images move, but I think instead, perhaps an interest in adding the dimension of time to their practice, which would encompass movement as well as many other possibilities. The introduction of time and temporality opens up a massively vast array of distinctive conceptual, aesthetic, and expressive possibilities. And starting to work with animation, Breer could suddenly work in a very different manner with themes of change, transformation, repetition, variation, collage, kineticism, and even more intangible and conceptual possibilities like wit, confusion, boredom, surprise, all functioning in direct relation to the dimension of time in a new and expressive way. So obviously time plays a role in our interaction with painting too, but the crucial difference I feel is that a painting fundamentally exists as a timeless static object, and the temporal potential that it represents and its dynamism as an artwork are very much brought to it through our experience of it. In most situations, the amount of time that we spend with a painting is entirely up to us, whether it's 1 second or 1 hour, or 100 visits of varying lengths over the course of 30 years. Our active role as viewers deciding how much of our time we'll give to a painting is crucial to our connection with the artwork and is in many ways a function of our own minds, feelings, and engagement. It even changes, possibly quite radically, from experience to experience of the same painting. But in most cases, our temporal relationships to paintings are dictated very much by us. With film shown in a cinema, the opposite is the case. The film and the filmmaker who made it decide how long we will experience the artwork. If it's 1.5 minutes, like form phases, then it'll take 1.5 minutes to experience the complete work. It's not up to us. Of course, we can close our eyes or leave the cinema, but then we have expressly not experienced the total artwork. So essential to this process is the understanding by each viewer that we're going to a cinema to watch a film of a certain length. As cinema viewers, we implicitly agree to turn over this temporal control to the artwork and to the artist behind it. And given that control, I think some of the most interesting filmmakers are ones who have worked in a manner that is conscious of that implicit ceding of power by the audience. In 1968, artist Morgan Fisher made a film called Five Phenomenon, in which a single uninterrupted shot of a clock is shown for 11 continuous minutes. Prior to shooting, Morgan had actually removed the second hand from the clock to make it less perceptible that the hands of the clock were even moving. The film begins with a title card explaining that what you are about to see is a standard clock running properly at a normal rate for 11 straight minutes. And yet, despite being told that the clock is a normal one, that it's running at a normal rate, our heightened awareness of our own perception with regard to passing time works to challenge and distort this consciousness in interesting ways. The fact that Morgan has even told us extremely clearly and honestly up front precisely what we'll be experiencing for the next 11 minutes calls even more attention to the subjective qualities of passing time. To start with, we may first wonder if he's lying to us, or we question whether the film is really 11 minutes long or running at a normal speed, or if the minute hand of the clock is really moving. Interestingly, some people do perceive the minute hand of the clock moving, and many don't. Even this, the perception of movement as depicted in the film, is highly subjective and probably relates primarily to our own individual state of mind and engagement. When Morgan originally made this film in 1968, almost universally the reaction was that one could not really perceive the minute hand moving, including the filmmaker. In 2008, when I worked with him on the restoration of the film, we were screening a 16mm print of it at the laboratory when Morgan actually very suddenly leaned forward in his seat, and in a surprised voice, he said, "You can see the hand moving." So, but the film hadn't changed over 40 years, so it must have been Morgan Fisher that had changed. The movement of the minute hand had been visible all along, but perhaps it needed 40 years for us to catch up to it. Throughout the 1950s, living in Paris, Robert Breer continued to paint alongside his burgeoning animation practice, which came to embrace diverse approaches to abstraction and the non-objective, as well as working with cutouts, figurative sequences, cartoons, and eccentric collage reminiscent of Kurt Schwitter's. Without extensive interaction with other artists working in animation, Breer really developed his own radical approach to animation and film throughout his Paris period, seeming to innovate in different ways with each successive film. His 1956 film, Recreation, which you just saw, running less than 2 minutes, is genuinely somewhat revolutionary and represents his first cinematic exploration of radical discontinuity in an approach that he would further explore in Blazes 5 years later. Breer had been experimenting with film loops, so like continuous loops of film, prior to Recreation, in which every single frame was different from every other one. These loops emerged from his consideration of the medium at its essence, which is a dualistic medium composed of both a physical dimension and a temporal ephemeral dimension. A loop of film consisting of entirely unrelated frames is on one hand a sort of static visible gallery of miniature compositions all side by side on the film strip. And on the other hand, a hyperkinetic explosion of color, shape, and illusory movement when set into motion on a film projector. The film Recreation is a more sophisticated articulation of these loop experiments, in that it balances passages of individually unrelated frames in a super fast barrage, along with occasional short, continuous sequences of visual respite, which are often humorous in nature, such as when the mechanical mouse runs across the tabletop. By combining these two approaches in a formally daring yet playful manner, Breer has taken the fundamental innovation of utter discontinuity in a medium which until then has been implicitly defined by its essential continuity, and then added complexity and dynamism through these brief interludes of more conventional cinematic motion. I referred to the film loops, and by extension, the film Recreation, as in one sense a gallery of individual compositions organized side by side along the film strip. In fact, this photo shows a complete 35mm film print of Recreation mounted as an object on the gallery wall. And in another sense, separate from like a series of photos or a sort of an album of images, these films could be thought of, I think, as sculptures. They're constructed objects made of disparate parts. The reference I made earlier to Kurt Schwitter's is especially useful here. As I discussed with Blazes, the individual frames create a complete whole, but they also resist being absorbed into that whole, since they're intrinsically unconnected to each other, except by virtue of appearing on the film strip in succession with each other. This sense of the films as sculptural, challenging the dominant notion of continuity in cinema as constructed, defiant objects, is fundamental to Breer's development as an animator and a filmmaker. He spoke at times of a displeasure with the so-called magic of film projection, which Christoph actually spoke about earlier, the idea of like this cone of light coming out of the back of the room from the projection booth. But Breer was actually sort of uninterested and distrustful of this notion of cinema, the magic of it, the way that the medium is dematerialized in its cinematic performance. A mysterious beam of light protrudes from a secret room at the back of the space, and a film appears on the screen rendered by light and color, only to completely disappear when the projector is turned off. The relationship between the physical film strip and the projected performance of that film strip is a very abstract one. And Breer was interested in figuring out ways to reinforce the material aspects of the medium and his process to make the whole endeavor more concrete in a way. Breer tried many different approaches to concretize his work in film as a way of getting away from the secular mysticism of the ephemeral film projection. He mixed various techniques within a single film. He employed unexpected resizings of the frame, occasionally painted and scratched directly onto the film strip. He created playful interactions and tensions between two-dimensional and three-dimensional space. His soundtracks are often these mysterious textural accompaniments, and there are many other ideas that he worked with. Upon returning to America and settling in New York in 1959, he more or less gave up painting for the time being to focus on film and animation, and a bit later sculpture as well. Animation didn't exactly have a strong visibility or reputation in the art world. It kind of still doesn't, to be honest. That's why it's so fantastic that the Fondazione is given this beautiful space and time for Breer and his work, including his animation. But the general need for a gallery at that time to display art which had some kind of physical dimension coincided, I think, with Breer's interest in allowing his work in animation to achieve a more concrete presence somehow. In Paris, he had already experimented with creating small flipbooks of short animation sequences. But the possibilities of a flipbook to have a physical presence in a gallery was quite limited. One imaginative solution to the problem was his creation of several mutoscopes. So based on an early cinematic era device, in which sequential frames of a film would be printed on cards that one could then turn through with a hand crank to animate them into motion, Breer eventually fashioned his own mutoscope-inspired hand-cranked animation sculptures, at least partly solving the dilemmas of how to display his work in a gallery, his work in animation, that is, and as well as how to properly materialize the work in a way that affirmed its physicality and presence, separate from its cinematic projection. These mutoscope constructions didn't take the place of the films, but rather existed in a manner that was parallel and also somewhat interrelated to his animation practice. Going back to my comments about time and the completely different and active role a viewer takes on in a gallery versus a cinema, these mutoscope works have a fascinating way of existing temporally, much more in the mode of painting, as objects to be engaged with at the spectator's will, and yet they are also moving image objects which have an intrinsic temporal dimension to consider. He even made stereoscopic versions to render a 3D animated image. With these sculptures and their dual relationship to time as both movies and objects, Breer doesn't quite get to have it both ways, but he gets pretty close, I think. Working on Breer's films as his film archivist, I've run across a lot of fascinating, unexpected little bits and pieces, which are sometimes quite illuminating about specific films or his work in general. I want to show you a short title sequence he created on 16mm film to theoretically add to the beginning of a short program of his animation work. The title sequence dates to 1959, and being in English, he probably created it right around the time of his return to America, presumably as part of a conscious decision to present his film work as a new arrival in the New York film and art worlds. So here it is, and I'll read it out loud too. The 4 films you are about to see represent the recent efforts of an abstract painter to apply to the film medium some of his notions about time and space. What may seem at first to be an outrageous assault on the eyes or a runaway projector is actually an intentional speeding up of sight sensations in hopes of producing, as in a mosaic, a stronger total image by this jamming together of many bright fragments. Now, I don't know if he ever actually ended up using this title sequence when he showed his films upon getting back to the United States, but the very fact that he composed it and filmed it for possible use suggests the obstacles that he imagined he might encounter, not just as a painter working in film, but as an artist who was doing quite radical and potentially provocative things with the film medium. The tone of the title card has an almost apologetic quality, as he acknowledges that some people may think the projector is going crazy rather than the film's being a deliberate artistic statement. And even if this text on the title sequence inevitably simplifies his true aims and ideas, I think the reference to time and space as themes is quite revealing, representing as it does some of the essential and seemingly unresolvable respective qualities of painting and cinema. I also love the ending in which he compares his films to a mosaic, in which a, quote, stronger total image is produced by, quote, this jamming together of many bright fragments. It's really a poetic description, and it reveals an eagerness to connect his film and animation work with ideas suggesting physical presence and the sculptural. So the first part of this talk has been primarily about relationships between painting and film, as well as Breer's unique perspective on cinema and animation as a medium which comprises material and temporal elements. This has been limited to Breer's first decade as a filmmaker, and I'd like to expand the scope to consider his ongoing development over the ensuing decades of his career. Part of what I find so incredible about Breer's animation practice as it developed over 50 years of activity is the very vividly clear way that he is always experimenting and innovating, trying out new techniques and eagerly moving from approach to approach, and yet never abandoning what he learns and discovers along the way. To look at his work chronologically is to perceive that he was constantly adding new ideas and techniques to his filmmaking vocabulary. In each successive film, one can discover the inspirations, lessons, and explorations of every film which came before it. I almost think of his practices like a snowball rolling down a hill, getting bigger and bigger as it collects more and more snow on its journey. In the early 1960s alone, he made films in a collage style, in live action, in a non-objective mode, in a documentary mode, and in a cartoon style, really trying out many different ways of exploring cinematic motion, expression, and change. It was also around this time that Breer began to conceptualize his fantastic kinetic sculptures, known collectively as floats. So these moving objects were designed in a wide variety of forms, shapes, sizes, and materials, but they all share one quality in common. They all moved very slowly. I love these floats. Their design is somehow both formally concise and whimsical, like they have personality. Their humor and their playfulness comes in part from the seeming incongruity between their featureless minimal forms and their slow creeping movement. As kinetic sculptures, they do not engage in dramatic theatrical gestures or radically transforming motion. Instead, they just slowly move around, not calling attention to themselves, and yet continuously engaging in a redefinition of the space they inhabit. I want to skip forward to another part of this documentation footage. Part of the concept of these sculptures was the way that their movement may not even be noticed by people at the exhibition. This is some documentation footage from the early 70s of an installation. I would have loved to have been at this. So you just have these like little creeping guys moving around, but if we speed it up a little bit, you can kind of see a few of them are moving a little faster than others. Instead, so part of the concept, as I said, is that the movement may not even be noticed as it's happening, and instead, one might suddenly realize that one of these large white dome sculptures seemed to be in a somewhat different place than it was just 30 seconds before. In this way, I like to think of them in terms of Morgan Fisher's clock film, which I described earlier. The articulation of motion is defined more by our realization that something has moved from where it previously was, rather than by actually seeing it move. I also love thinking of these sculptures in terms of his animation practice, because both work at the intersection of time and space. But whereas that conjunction of these two mediums may suggest movement or motion as the uniting theme, I think it's really more fundamentally about change. Change is a really powerful concept at work in Breer's art, specifically his time-based art, of course, which would include not just the films, but also the floats and even his mutoscopes and other sculptural animation devices. Change can be fluid or sudden or erratic or predictable or completely unstable. The quality of change is unfixed. It's essentially the concept of difference over time. The approach that Breer took to animation and kinetic sculpture seems to me in many ways to be precisely about that, difference over time. Here's an image of an early kinetic animation device of Breer's, and one which I think is really quite brilliant and special, as it operates with some fundamentals of animation and perception in a way that seems to me characteristically Breer. It's based on a pre-cinematic device called a thaumatrope. Some of you may have seen these. Typically, it's a two-sided disc with a different image printed on each side. A classic combination is illustrated here, an empty cage on one side and a figure on the other. With string threaded through the two sides of the disc, one can twirl the string around to allow the disc to rotate rapidly. Quickly enough, and the two sides of the disc seem to converge as a single composite image of the figure inside the cage. Now, we know that the two images aren't really simultaneous, but if the disc is spun fast enough, our eyes and brain are fooled to see them that way. And knowing that we're being fooled is a huge part of the pleasure and the wonder of this kind of phenomenon. Breer's thaumatrope device is called dot dash and dates from the late 1950s. And as you can see, the title indicates the nature of its opposing images, a dot and a dash. When spun quickly enough, the dot and the dash converge to make a single shape. Although a dot and dash combination might suggest Morse code and all the themes and associations that might conjure, I like the idea that more likely these two figures are also just fundamental symbols, which stand for nothing specific, other than the idea of basic form. And when this thaumatrope is spun and the dot and the dash converge, the composite result is a purely visual experiential one, which is rooted not in obvious metaphor or symbolism, but in the genuine pleasure of visual play. In 1966, Breer returned to pure non-objective animation with his film 66, following it in 1968 with his widely known classic 69, and then 70 2 years later. This is one of the animation drawings for 69, which begins with a geometric sequence of various draftsman-like shapes, seeming to rotate through the cinematic space with an unexpected mathematical precision. Within a short period of time of developing these sequences, though, Breer begins to interrupt, deconstruct, and destroy this precision by asserting additional visual material, and even manipulating the focus and the exposure of the photography. It starts out gently as he modestly embellishes some of the individual moments of each movement. You know, maybe adding color on an individual frame basis. And the ultimate perversion of order then occurs when in the last third of the film, Breer has actually shuffled the animation cards out of order to produce startlingly kinetic results like this. I think this film is really significant and representative of some of the themes I've been discussing because it nearly functions as a demonstration or a pedagogical tool for Breer's philosophy of animation. We witness a transition from order to disorder and have a palpable sense of Breer's own pleasure at dismantling the system he created, which begins the film. There's a sense of devilish play at work and many humorous moments as the film's orderly system begins to lose its fluidity and eventually its chronology. These transformations even take on some fairly vivid metaphorical tones without Breer ever foregrounding that potential layer of meaning. The progression from order to disorder isn't predictable or regular either. Ironically, a perfect systemic disordering of the sequence would itself represent another kind of order. The deconstruction itself is irregular and full of surprise, the final touch being Breer's actual shuffling of the cards to take some of the compositional control away from even the artist himself. If we return to the concepts of keyframes and in-betweens, 69 represents a situation where Breer stages a revolution of the in-betweens to transform into keyframes. For me, all of these qualities connect us back to the fundamental theme and phenomenon of change and of difference over time. And despite the largely abstract nature of the film's imagery, it evinces a remarkable humanity and personality. The film and its qualities of process, the film and its qualities and process of change over 4.5 minutes embodies many reactions, and I think genuinely emotions, as it expresses a sense of play, wonder, surprise, irritation, and engagement, and which I think those themes and those reactions can genuinely extend further to themes of empathy, intimacy, subjectivity, memory, and experience. Suggesting those complex human themes and emotions to be part of an abstract film might be a bit bold, but considering what comes next in Breer's development of his animation practice, I don't think it's unreasonable. And after the follow-up abstract film 70, which came a year after, or 2 years after 69, Breer began to work on another graphical film in the series, which was originally to be called 72. But in the midst of creating the drawings for it, he constructed his own rotoscope animation system, which completely changed the project and also his entire approach for the rest of his career. The rotoscope approach to making animation was invented in 1917 by the American animator Max Fleischer. Because the equipment itself can vary greatly, the simplest way to describe it is that it's a process of making animation in which live action photographic footage is redrawn a frame at a time by tracing over a projection of the live action footage. So here you have this lovely 1917 gentleman tracing a photographic image that's been projected onto the back of his screen there from a piece of film footage that has been photographed previously. So the original impetus for Fleischer to develop this process was actually to bring the possibility of more lifelike movement into animation. And for decades, this was really the only way this technology was used. In 1972, Breer constructed his own variation of a rotoscope apparatus and began to experiment with using home movies and other live action photography as a basis for redrawn animation sequences. Rotoscope animation has a really unusual, uncanny quality because of its direct basis in live action photographed movement. So even if the rotoscope animation style is quite simple or quite reduced, its movements have a basis in reality, and this effect can be quite powerful. Breer was among the earlier independent animations to experiment extensively with rotoscope animation. Actually, the amazing Italian animator Manfredo Manfredi beat him to it by a few years. And there are some other examples prior to the late 60s. But really, I've come across very few, if any, examples of true rotoscope techniques being used by independent animators outside of the commercial studio system, before the late 60s at least. With obvious enthusiasm for this new possibility in his animation practice, Breer abandoned the original plan for the '72 film and made a completely different work, incorporating rotoscope sequences along with many of his other techniques. And the film was released under the title Gulls and Buoys. But the very next year, Breer began work on what would become one of his most widely seen and acclaimed films, which is Fuji. In Fuji, the integration of techniques and the already very advanced use of the rotoscope process make the film a highly engaging, hypnotic, and personal work with a very heightened sense of subjectivity and recalled memory, thanks in large part due to his employment of rotoscope footage of home movies filmed during a visit to Japan a few years earlier. The film's vocabulary of images is actually somewhat minimal, and Breer's exploration of them is intuitive and methodical, as he sometimes even slows them down to a slideshow pace to emphasize the material presence of the drawings and also to destroy the illusion of motion. That's one of the thrilling things about Breer's use of rotoscope. The technology is in many ways meant to improve and emphasize fluid naturalistic motion. That's one of the original reasons for its invention. And yet Breer, with his interest in discontinuity and materiality, both accentuates and denies this fluidity by breaking it up irregularly or interweaving unrelated sequences a frame at a time. And in Fuji in particular, the shape of the iconic mountain lends itself beautifully to geometric abstraction. I want to show you a short sequence from the film in which all of these approaches are at work. For me, Fuji is really the first film of Breer's mature period in which his mastery of animation, which nearly feels like a reinvention of the medium, falls thrillingly into place with the integration of the rotoscope into his arsenal of techniques. The rotoscope material, which remains a wonderful fixture in much of his work up to his very last film, enables him to add the rich potential of a more complex emotionality and subjectivity. I suggested earlier that even the film 69, despite its abstraction, perhaps contains some essence of the themes of empathy, intimacy, subjectivity, memory, and experience. But in Fuji, these ideas emerge vividly for the first time. The use of repetitions, variations, speed changes, transformations, and other interventions throughout the rotoscope material connect deeply to a sense of memory and subjectivity. Our brains don't remember things in the form of classic Hollywood narrative filmmaking. Our memories are really highly impressionistic. They're fleeting, they're filled with repetition and variation, free associations, confusing connections, and complex triggers from other senses. Our memory doesn't embody time in this artificially linear way. This is part of why I think film has such a powerful potential to evoke subjectivity, memory, and emotion. And for me, Breer's use of the medium, particularly starting in the early 70s, represents a deeply engaging and influential development in personal filmmaking. And at the basis of this remain the notions of change and difference rather than continuity or linearity. Breer's work continued to develop, and he continued to progressively incorporate new techniques and ideas into his films. For example, in his 1976 film Rubber Cement experimented with the then new technology of color xerography. His approach to pacing and composition grew ever more sophisticated, and his films sometimes incorporated a bewildering variety of visual ideas, which worked in an incredibly coherent and complex language that was singularly his own. The more you view his films, the more you learn how to read them, and the more you find there. His influence on many generations of filmmakers, and particularly animators, is massive. And he really kind of contagiously demonstrates with his films the basic principles of animation through a process that is wonderfully pleasurable of breaking and reinventing those rules over and over again. His wit, his enthusiasm, his sense of play, and his personality are incredibly present in his work. And this, combined with his brilliant use of color and composition and his incredible grasp of timing, give his work a deep and recognizable humanity that so many filmmakers have responded to. I love that moment. Beginning in the mid-1980s, his films became even more personal and autobiographical, and his last few films, although still playful as ever, are quite moving in their awareness of his older age and the poetic ephemerality of existence. Two in particular, Time Flies from 1997 and his last film, What Goes Up from 2003, really vividly express the sense of a consciousness looking around itself at the present moment, while understanding that this present is made up of a richly interwoven collection of all the memories and moments of the past. In some ways, conventional linear time is at its most disjunctive and discontinuous in these last films, and no one can tell the difference between keyframes and in-betweens anymore. And yet there's a sweeping fluidity in the chaos, which is not actually chaos, a fluidity which is utterly and only Brier's. It's a very special kind of fluidity, which we realize is the passage of Brier's identity and consciousness. And this is because Brier's powers as an artist and as an animator are really at their greatest in these two films. And his use of decades worth of ideas and techniques, all in an ever-changing relation to each other and marked by his deep humanity and subjectivity, are utterly and completely integrated. I'd like to finish up by showing you Robert Brier's 1997 film, Time Flies. And here we are back at the beginning in an endless loop. So, that's the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. And I don't know if we're doing questions or anything, but well, I still am on camera here. I thought it would be fun. And I want to thank Kate Flax for this. I do have some original animation cards from Time Flies that I would love to share with you. So let's see here. Let's see. Here they are here. So I got my glove on. I'm an archivist. But we can talk, or I don't know, Christoph, if you're coming back, if anybody has questions or would like to let me make sure these are upside down actually.
What animation cards are these, Mark?
These are from Time Flies, which we just saw.
Okay.
So, I can show you some of these images. Some of, as you can see, just a line, so simple. And they range because his approach is so dynamic from frame to frame. Sometimes you'll have these incredibly minimal images followed by really elaborate ones. I think I have a few examples of that here, but we'll see eventually. But here you also have a sense of brief sequences of sequential motion. Oops. See with the glove, it's kind of hard to get a grasp of these carefully. Hold on. There we go. Yeah. It's really quite beautiful. In a way, I wanted to do this at the end because it sort of brings us back to this notion of stepping through the frames of the film Blazes. And considering these as individual artworks removed from their context in the film. But yeah, I don't know if we're, Elisa, are we doing questions at all or any further discussion? I wasn't sure if that was happening.
There's someone saying amazing presentation, Mark.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Did any of the Rotoscopes use cards that had been used in the films?
That I actually don't know. That might be a question for Natalie. I don't know if she's present at all. I'm really not certain though. I feel like most likely not, because I think the Mutascopes, when he switched to, these are 4x6" cards, and when he switched to these, like for several decades of his film career, like from the 60s until his death, this was a very dominant medium that he used, these index cards of this particular size. Prior to this, he used a variety of different sizes of paper, some different dimensions, full sheets of 8x10 or 8.5x11. I love this one. You have the building coming from behind the ear. And you can see here he's alternating sequences, like two different continuities that have been interwoven. And then even using, in this case, here's a photocopy of his own ear. And then here's an actual photograph. As you noticed in Time Flies, there's the use of actual snapshots, not necessarily even photographs made for the film, but just casual photographs. This film, I wanted to show it partly because I love its feeling of the everyday and the ordinary, but the poetry of the ordinary and the connection to memory.
We have another question mark, which says, I find it interesting his compositions use the whole card, which is rectangular, but then filmed them on 60 millimeters, which is more square. Do you think he improvised the framing when shooting the cards?
Well, that's a good question. And I can't say that I know precisely the answer to it, but some of his cards do very much respect the 4:3, the very general 4:3 aspect ratio of 16 millimeter film. But then others, as in these, they're a little wider. 4:6 is not the same as the 16 millimeter aspect ratio. But the thing with animation is that usually in most animation, it's important to be able to register your image so that as you're shooting each successive frame, the drawing is in the exact same position, because otherwise, you know, the finished film might be moving around like this. But since Breer is working so much with discontinuity and change, I think he probably could improvise a bit as to the placement of the card. Because whereas typically it would be very important to keep it precisely in the same place, each successive card, you know, his images are changing so rapidly from frame to frame. But that said, by this point, 1997, he's just such an intuitive, like experienced expert at how to produce his work. There's an incredible amount of sophistication and technical capability in his work, but I think it's all second nature to him at this point. He's one thing I didn't mention is that unlike most animators, because animation is a very labor-intensive process, usually it's more common, I think, for the majority of animators, even experimental animators, to plan out your sequences quite a bit in advance so that you're not doing a whole bunch of extra work that's unnecessary. So there's really a lot of pre-planning. But Breer actually worked very improvisationally. He would shoot all these sequences and then maybe play around with the ordering of the cards. And then he would have all this footage. And then he would actually edit his films quite extensively. So I feel like the editing process for animators is usually not so much done after shooting, but before shooting, you might say. So like the preconception of the structure of the film is worked out in advance, because then, of course, it makes it much more efficient and economical as a process. But because Breer is also, so much of the structure of the films is discovered after the shooting, like in the editing process, you have also the potential for him to play around a lot, maybe with the framing too. These are just incredible to look at, I think.
Mark, there is one question. I would say let's make it the last one.
Sure.
If that's fine for everyone. At least I don't see any other questions. I'm just going to read it to you, okay?
Sure.
How was the color added in the film 69? It looked more like cut-out colored paper that was glued to the cards rather than markers.
Yeah, there's a mix. And in fact, throughout a lot of his films, his earlier films would adhere to maybe a little bit more consistent mediums. Like in one film, there might be certain specific limited techniques at work. And this is what I said when I described his process, almost like a snowball rolling down a hill and absorbing different techniques and then integrating them into his practice. By the time he gets to particularly the 80s, he's using so many different mediums, like, yeah, magic markers and cutouts. I wish I had pictures of them. Oh, you know, if you can indulge me for just a second, I can share a video with you and show you something really quite interesting. Let's see, I have it right here. I shot a video earlier this week at Kate's place. These are animation cards for the film 70. And I sped it up by 4 times to make it faster. But here you can see the cards actually have holes, like shaped holes cut into them. And he's used airbrush, spray paint, and this film has some other like hard-edged lines and stuff in it too. But just to give you an idea, like in 1970, each film he's experimenting with different ideas, and in this case, even like cutting shapes out of the animation cards to create these sort of windows to the card underneath or to a different image underneath. And so by the late 60s, with the film like 69, there's a few different techniques. I think I had some slides showing some of those animation cards, and it was a combination of like really specific lines done with a pen, along with yeah, like some like stick-on solid color material. He would use torn paper cutouts. As you saw with the images from Rubber Cement, he used color Xeroxing capabilities to create some unusual images. Later on, by the time of Time Flies, he's using, you know, magic markers and, you know, maybe charcoal, all kinds of different techniques, photos and pieces of photos and photocopies. And by his late films, he's really integrating so many different mediums and techniques, but it's all so seamless because his I feel like, and not to get overly poetic about it, but his consciousness is such a vivid part of these works. Like you really feel this. I love this part here. It's actually upside down. But his consciousness is so present, and you get the feeling that as diverse and varied as the techniques and the images are, and as rapid as the changes in the films, there's this sort of guiding consciousness through them that I feel like we can really connect to as viewers. Anyway, I just thought that this would be kind of a fun thing to share. So yeah.
Okay. There's just a lot of people saying thank you. It was amazing. I think
well, thank you, and I want to thank Christoph too. I want to thank Christoph for his presentation. It was so wonderful to have some contextualization and historical setup and all these earlier reference points. You know, that essentially created a context for Briere to emerge into film from painting, like so many people before him. So yeah, Christoph, thank you. It was so cool to see that and to see you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Christoph.
Thank you, Antonio.
It was very, very interesting for me too. I'm not an expert about experimental film, about this kind of films, but it's very, very, I think for everybody interesting to understand how Briere made these films. It's a very poetic, and I like it very much. Yes, and have a nice day in Los Angeles. Have a nice day in Vienna. Many greetings from Bolzano, from the beautiful Elisa, beautiful Silvia. And nothing. We stay in touch for other, maybe other objects about Briere, other subjects and materials about Robert Briere. And thank you another time to Natalie from GB Agency. Thank you to all.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, to the people asking about the recording, it will be available online. Someone was asking about the book examples from Christoph. I'm sure I don't know if he can still hear us, but I'm sure he will share them with us and we can post it on our website. All the information regarding all of what happened tonight and all of what was sent out in the last week in the form of newsletters containing different film festivals from Europe. You can find it all on our website. I think I've said it 1,000 times now that everything is on our website. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good evening, and to you, Mark. Or to everyone from overseas, good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.